Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And thanks to everyone. Thanks to A&M for inviting me here. We set this up quite a while ago, and so I'm very happy to make it and to talk to all of you about some things that we're doing at NREL and some things that I've been doing. And feel free to ask questions. We'll hopefully leave a little time at the end, or certainly if you have a clarifying question to go for, feel free to put your hand up. How many of your students? How many are faculty or other related? Okay, great. So about 2/3 of it. All right, okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit. This is kind of what I'm going to go through. I'm going to talk a little bit about NREL. I think most of you maybe know NREL, but I'll talk a little bit about maybe our current strategy and where we're going. I'm going to talk about history of energy transitions, because you can't necessarily understand the future without understanding where we've come from. Talk about some scenarios of future energy systems with a focus on 100% energy scenario that my colleagues at NREL did that focused on 100% renewable, like clean electricity by 2035. And then close with some future technologies for future transitions that maybe some of you who are students can think about your research careers going forward. So just a little bit about NREL. Most of you may know there's 17 U.S. Department of Energy national laboratories scattered around the country. You will notice there's a lack of them in Texas, but we'll talk about that later. I am here in Colorado, which was once part of Texas, you could argue. A little sliver. If you look at old maps, there's a little bit of sliver of Colorado that is part of Texas. And that's where National Renewable Energy Lab is. And our mission is we are the only national lab that is focused on renewable energy and energy efficiency only. So none of the other labs also have broader portfolios, but we are focused on those technology areas. Started in 1977 as a response to the oil crisis that was in the 70s. We have grown to about almost 3,000 employees, but we have quite a few postdocs, interns, and many visiting professionals. So those of you who are students who are interested in postdocs or internships, go to our website. We've got a lot of positions posted. And those of you who are faculty, we have visiting, people come visit for sabbaticals or for the summer. This is our main campus, and you can see some of the topic areas that we research, all the different renewable types, as well as the integration of them with each other. And we have a very large energy analysis and modeling group, about 300 people or so, that just focus on analysis. And then we have a site that's about 30 minutes away that has full-scale wind turbines for testing wind turbines, as well as manufacturing processes and integration. And this is just a kind of another summary of some of the technical areas NREL focuses on for all the renewable powers that are possible, all the sustainable transportation, energy efficiency, energy systems integration going forward. And then just a little bit about kind of our future strategy and strategy that we're going as NREL grew from a technology developer and analysis, really focused on the development of renewable energy technologies. As those became more commercial and available, we designed this structure where we're focused on the integrated energy pathways, how energy technologies work together, but also how we can go electrons to molecules, because the recognition that materials are very important, and how we can convert renewable energy or clean energy to those different materials. And then what are we going to do with all these things at the end of their life? So that's a circular economy. So there's a lot of concern about that. And so this is kind of our strategy areas. All right, so now onto my topic, and I'm going to start a little bit. I mentioned it's good to understand the past when you're thinking about where you're going in the future. And I think my key point on this is that energy transitions are not new. We like to talk about that we're in an energy transition as if that's some exotic new thing that's happening. But, prior to about 1850, the US and the world was 100% renewable energy because it was animal and biopower. So we have the transition to coal, which is the gray line here, was really just happening in that industrial revolution in the late 1800s. And as we started to develop the different industrial processes and other things. So the transition is really, we've been undergoing a transition for the last 150 years. And then it's also interesting to note that oil and gas just passed petroleum right about 1950. So that's past coal, past coal in that time frame. This is and this is total energy consumption. This is not electricity. This is total energy consumption. But you can see sort of the rise of petroleum, the rise of gas, and then most recently, so this is where we're talking about the most recent transition, the decline of coal and the increase of natural gas and renewables in replacing those materials. So, several phases of transition from the Industrial Revolution to the move to electricity. So electricity really became fully commercial in this 1900 to 1950, and then now transitioning to more potentially away from coal, definitely away from coal, maybe away from other fossil fuels going forward. So transitions are not new, they are continual. And just to give kind of some examples of those, if you look at lighting, lighting was wood and candles, and then it got replaced with lamp oil, which was an amazing innovation at the time. And in fact, some of that came from whale oil. And so that whale oil was really burned very clean and a good quality of light. But and while it's technically renewable, it is not renewable on a scale that it was being used. So we ended up having town gas and then kerosene that replaced those oil lamps. And we actually hit peak whale oil in 1846. So you hear about peak oil now, the peak whale oil. So I like to say that the oil and gas industry saved the whales, because it ended up replacing where we got our lighting from. And then, of course, we had the conversion to electricity, that incandescent lamps replaced the gas lamp. And actually, that's what this picture is. This was a demonstration in 1878, where they did every other light was electric and every other light was gas. And so they were demonstrating how much brighter that these lights were. This actually was run by a little generator, because there was no grid at that time. So it was run by a generator to run those electric lights. And then they shut it all off. And then it was another couple decades before they ended up with electric lights. But kind of an example of demonstration project, how you show the public what a new technology is like and how that's important. And then, of course, now we're kind of at the end stages of replacing our incandescent lights with LED lights, which are much more efficient, produce a lot less heat, give us a lot of benefits as well. Another famous transition, the horse to the automobile. So this is in New York. They have a tradition, or they did at the time, of everybody on Easter morning going out and driving up and down Fifth Avenue, showing off your horse and carriage. And in 1900, you had one guy with an electric car. And by 1913, you had one horse, which I think is right about here, in all vehicles. One terrified horse, I say, around all those cars. So this transition, you think about rapid transitions, that's just 13 years to go from horse and carriage in New York City to cars. However, that was New York City. So that's the people that were wealthy, the people that had that were interested in new technologies and going forward on that. So it took many more decades for that transition. I'll show another example of that in a minute. One key thing to remember on transitions is that we had in the late 1800s, when we had all those horses, what do horses produce? They produce a lot of manure. So there was an article in at the time, I think it was in London, that predicted that there would be the great horse manure crisis of 1894. It predicted that in 50 years, London and New York would be about feet deep in horse manure, because they wouldn't be able to do that. Well, of course, we didn't have great horse manure crisis because we invented the automobile. And so all the horses were no longer on the city streets. So really, the automobile solved a huge environmental and public health crisis in urban areas. However, 50 years later, we had this. So you solve one problem, but sometimes you create another. So we had major smog and city events because of all the emissions from those vehicles, as well as, of course, industry as well. So the key thing key point I'm trying to make on transitions and thinking about them is you want to think about what problem are you trying to solve, but then what new problem might you create? And if you can think about that in advance, how do you mitigate or solve that problem before it actually becomes a smog event where you're killing people from air pollution? And then just as an example of how long these transitions can take. So the transition from animals to vehicles, tractors, was happening in the early 1900s. So this was an advertisement at the time that a new tractor That's the work of 9 horses and three people. But that transition, so the blue line here is tractors and the red line is horses. Horses or tractors did not take over from horses until 1950. That's only 70 years ago. My great grandparents were farming still with horses. So not that long ago, it's within generations. So these transitions often can be very quick, as we saw with the automobile, but they can also be the tails of them can be very slow. And you can see that with these sort of technology adoption rates. So this is an example of different technologies and when they started, when they were at about 10% for most of these for households or for industry, and then how they eventually reached 100%. And so, you know, the automobile about this late 1918 stage, about 10% of households ramped up. We hit World War II here, Great Depression. It's kind of slowed its uptake, but it took, you know, many decades for it to really reach the full area. Electricity access is particularly interesting because we had a rapid increase. We had a little slowdown during the Great Depression. And then, but it still took, you know, until 1940, 1950 before you had 100% electricity access. So again, not that long ago. And that took some really special policies around the rural electrification, because often the urban areas get these new technologies, but the rural areas take longer. So that's something, again, to be thinking about transitions. How do you think about access for everybody and equal access for everybody going forward? The one I find most interesting on here, that the only one that's gone down is the landline phone. So landline phone up, and we are now declining in the number of people who have landline phones because we have all gone to cell phones. You notice how steep the cell phone is. So really, people adopt technologies because it's got superior performance. It's a low enough cost, so people will pay more for new technologies if it's a low enough cost. So like people didn't need a color television, but it was when it got to a low enough cost, people then wanted it. So that means it also meets an interest. So it doesn't have to be a required technology, but it has to meet enough interest, be a low enough cost, or has a superior performance that it replaces an existing technology. So when we think about energy technologies, these are sort of the general things we want. So as we're seeing the renewable technologies grow, part of that is we are seeing the price decline for, this is just an example for PV panels, like it's just similar to batteries or wind turbines. And with PV, since it's an electronic, similar to a chip, it's got a law, Swanson's law, which is that modules will decrease by 20% for every doubling of manufacturing ship. And so we have seen that since 1970. This is a logarithmic scale. We've seen that since 1976. A few bumps here. There was a bit of a silicon shortage here. We had some other sort of trade issues going on. There's getting competition, various, you know, create kind of these bumps here. But we have pretty much been following that trend as the shipments of PV have increased. We are seeing a little bit of a notch up here in 2021. So the question is, have we reached the lowest cost on PV panels? We don't know. It could be a little temporary blip, or it could keep going down. So it'd be an interesting thing to see. Can't go to zero. And then this is just an example of, you know, our energy transition and electricity in the US. That's where we've been seeing most of you probably know this, you know, significant decline in coal. And this is generation, not capacity. Increased renewables have now surpassed coal. There was a little bit of a back and forth, and surpassed nuclear at this point in terms of the amount of generation. But really, it's natural gas driven by hydraulic fracturing, and then renewables driven by these constant. And you can see renewable wind and solar being the key. So later, I'm going to mention geothermal and some other, and hydro, because we are not seeing growth in those two technologies. I think those are both very underinvested. So when people talk about renewables, they frequently are only referring to solar and wind, but there's this whole category that we don't want to forget about. And then you think about how this transition looks. This is starting from 1955, and you're seeing this this wedge here of renewables that's growing pretty significantly. Hydropower, of course, has been staying pretty much the same. And then nuclear power also been pretty consistent over this time frame. But this is all, and then you see the increase in gas and the decline in coal. Another thing to remember to note about this chart is that it's flat at the top. So we had a growth in electricity up till about 2005, somewhere in this 2008, and then it really hasn't increased since then. However, we might see an increase if we start electrifying vehicles or buildings, heating industry. So something to think about. Other transitions in other countries have gone differently though, or dramatically. So if you look at the United Kingdom, for one thing, note they're down to the same amount of electricity they used about 1990 or late 80s. So they're actually declined in their amount of electricity. And they are getting similar to the US, about 40% renewables, but they've pretty much taken their coal power down to zero as they produce gas and renewables. And then I just spent 10 weeks in Japan, so I have to put one up here for Japan to show that they had, similar, they have flat to declining energy use, but they had a rather dramatic incident. So of course, after the Fukushima nuclear accident, they shut down all the nuclear power plants. They are reopening. But they were able to, but that resulted in an increase, you can see a significant increase in gas, a little bit of increase in coal, and then a very big growing solar. They are now third in solar. China, US, Japan, which is the total solar. So sometimes sometimes the transition is due to policy, sometimes it's due to economics, sometimes it's due to a specific incident. They are reopening their nuclear power plants, and you can see that. All right, so that's kind of thinking about the past. The key points being that transitions happen, it's perfectly normal, and you have different types of technologies coming and going, and there's different reasons why they grow and change. So thinking about some future scenarios, where are we going in the future? Well, the first thing I want to point out is you want to be careful on the definitions, because people are very loose in these definitions, and people say renewable energy, clean energy. So I wanted to put up a little bit and talk about, make sure we're all on the same page with when we say these different terminologies. So renewable energy being energy sources that do not deplete within sort of a human life civilization lifespan. And this is usually solar, wind, geothermal, usually biomass, but not always. Usually hydropower, but not always. Hydropower is renewable in the sense that the water is going to keep flowing, but there are some policies, some organizations do not include large hydro because it does have significant environmental and land use impacts. All of these technologies have environmental and land use impacts, but sometimes hydropower is included. Interesting, California doesn't include it in the first part of their policy for 2030, but they do include it for their 2050 goals. So sometimes it's included and not within the same policy. So it's interesting. But those goals are defined by production levels. Megawatt hours have nothing to do with greenhouse gas emissions directly. Then people will say carbon-free or zero greenhouse gas energy. So that includes, that's sources that do not generate CO2 significantly. I put significantly because of course everything generates a little bit. That generates CO2 or greenhouse gases. It's generally all renewable energy plus nuclear energy. But the goals are measured by emissions from the power generation. And then sometimes it includes upstream. So the amount of, so for example, if you have to manufacture the steel for a wind turbine or a plant, what emissions come from that? So sometimes it includes the upstream, and then occasionally includes the downstream when you actually decommission a facility. I would say that's actually more rare than including the upstream emissions. Net zero energy is the same as zero greenhouse carbon free, zero GHG energy, but it allows offsetting by other methods. So it could be carbon capture. So it's renewables, nuclears, and combustion of fuels with carbon capture. Also maybe allows direct air capture, nature-based carbon sinks, reforestation, regenerative agriculture. So it's a broader capacity. And then probably the most nebulous term is when people say clean energy or sustainable energy. I say clean energy all the time. It implies low levels of all types of pollution, so greenhouse gas emissions, but in theory, lower water use, other negative environmental impacts. It's when you use sustainable, it sometimes implies quality of life, economics, jobs. It usually some combination of renewable energy and net zero, but people do define it very differently. You're talking to. So whenever somebody says, including me, clean energy or sustainable energy, make sure you understand kind of what they're including in this categories. So I know this is a bit, you probably know a lot of this, but I think it's really important for us to be thinking about these terms that we use and how important. And you can see that from a policy perspective, this is why it's important, because every state's got a different goal, different year, and it's all based on different definitions. So sometimes it's renewable energy goals, sometimes it's clean energy goals. Different states include different different technologies. Sometimes they include hydro, sometimes they include different things. Sometimes they give extra credit. So these renewable portfolio standards are really an example of the policies that pushes towards renewable and or clean energy standards. I think the key one, interesting one here to note is Hawaii, 100% by 2045. That's 100% electricity for that. Guam is aiming for 25%. Puerto Rico is the one I point out, 100% by 2050. Some pretty aggressive goals here. I think Hawaii is the most aggressive state goal of the 100% by 2045. California. So this is where you're seeing a lot of the drive. However, one thing to remember is that there are already countries that are greater than 90% renewable electricity now. And there are 19 of them, actually, and some of these are close to 100%. So I kind of grouped them by region. And so you can see, and these are largely renewable based on hydropower and geothermal. So these are, none of these are 100% wind and solar. So again, renewables includes a lot of categories. So when people say is 100% electricity is not possible, obviously it is possible. Countries are already doing it. Do 100% renewable electricity. At least depending, what your energy mix is.
It's surprising, but the majority of these folks have very low GDP.
Yeah, except for Iceland, Norway.
Yeah,
some of the European countries. Yeah, some of them are fairly small. Some of them are, yeah. So some of it is a negative. You can always view it as a negative because the demand is very low, because they're not very wealthy countries, and maybe they actually have energy access issues. Other places, Costa Rica, Albania, Iceland, Norway, relatively wealthy countries that have very good geothermal and hydropower resources. There we go. So the key, though, if you're going to be looking at 100% of anything, and this I'm going to be talking more about 100% clean, which is renewables and nuclear, but obviously, even if you're running 100% on coal power or 100% on oil and gas, these are similar. The utility has some priorities when I'm running the grid, and the first thing is they want it to work. It needs to be reliable, it needs to be on. You need to match supply and demand, or at least you need to have at least more supply than demand. But you prefer to have it matched because you don't want to throw anything away. You need to keep the grid functioning. So the grid's got to be regulated in a way that you're not getting power surges or other things that are going to damage people's equipment or damage the grid itself. Then you need to be thinking about the future. It needs to be efficient so that you're not spending a lot of money. It needs to be good, fair rates to the people, the consumers. Ratepayers is like the worst term that utilities ever came up with, because I don't know what it implies. And then of course you've got people that are investing in these utilities, and so they have to have some sort of rate of return. Then kind of last on their list, but still important, is you want to reduce emissions and waste. So you don't want to be, generally utilities don't want to be polluting because someone's going to complain at them. And then they want to meet these renewable portfolio standards or other requirements going forward. So it's quite a challenge for them to be able to meet all these criteria. And so they do a lot of, and as you're adding more of these different types of technologies, especially solar and wind that are variable during the day, you need to be able to balance all this. The grid is an amazing thing because your supply is matching your demand. So your demand is changing constantly. That's this top line. And then the different supply is the different colors going forward. So this is just about a week, and this is the type of balancing that a grid, and this is modeled, but it's not, it's similar to what's being done in different facilities. So you've got your nuclear power here at the bottom. The benefit of nuclear power is it runs 24/7. It runs continuously. The negative is it's really hard to fluctuate it. So when you've got your demand going up and down, there's new technology is coming to be able to do it, but right now it's generally good you just run it. You got a little bit of coal here. And then what's happening is you've got your solar during the day, you've got your wind mostly in the evening and the nighttime, and then you're matching it with your gas combined cycle because you can kind of fluctuate that up and down. And you generally want to do the cheapest form of energy first, and then you bring on your more expensive forms. One other thing you note here is you can't quite see it, but this gray here, that's basically curtailment. There was too much energy on the system. They couldn't turn off the thermal systems. They couldn't turn them off or turn them down enough, and you had so much solar and wind. This is what you get called the duck curve. You'll get so much solar and wind during the day, it actually drops the other generation down, and then you have a big ramp up when people come home and turn on their air conditioners and hopefully don't plug in their electric car, but do all the things that. Okay, so one of the things that NREL does is we actually do modeling for what happens if you have a lot of renewables on the system. We have a lot of those variables, and is it going to be possible to run the grid at a national scale, but we also do it at a subnational scale. So I'm gonna hit a little animation here. This is also looking at most of you probably know there's an east grid, a western grid, and Texas. Its own thing because it's Texas. But you know, we didn't model them in because they aren't connected with anybody else, but good. But the lines are transmission, so large scale transmission. The red is, the red is nuclear, the blue is wind, the yellow when it comes up will be solar, and the green is gas combined cycle. So if we run the little animation here, you can see the sun's coming up, that's the line. And you can see all the yellow come up with the solar, and then you start, and you've got a lot of wind here in the middle. So you're having to transmit, because everyone's turned on their air conditioning here down in the south. And then you're transmitting the wind from Oklahoma and Kansas area up to the northern part. Sun comes down, the wind increases because you get a lot of wind in the evening. But then your nuclear power plants are running great, and you got your gas combined cycle, and then it's a good start. They cycle them down, and once again. So this is the kind of modeling, this is modeled on a 5-minute basis, and we model lots of different scenarios. So what happens if you have 30% solar? What happens if you have 50% solar? What happens if you have high wind? What happens if you build more transmission? What happens if you don't have transmission? So these are the kind of interesting models that one can run. And I think it's really important to do this so that people have confidence that this is possible or not possible based on different scenarios. And then you can also model different weather stress scenarios as well.
Just a quick question. This is great animation. Do you have a scenario where you show we cannot take it?
Yes, we try to break it. Yeah, basically. Yeah, there's definitely times you can run scenarios that
and all the good things.
Yeah.
Is there an example of the?
I don't have one on here, but obviously there are definitely examples. And there has been some post work on the big crisis here a couple of years ago when the grid failed or we had the shutdowns, about what are those weather conditions and what would have had to change and be different to avoid that. But yeah, you can push this to the point where you either don't have enough supply or don't have enough demand. Really, at that point, you curtail the demand. Is what happens. Which of course you can do that in a good way, and you can do it in a bad way. In terms of how it affects people. But yeah, this is definitely able. You can do failure analysis. In fact, we've done lots of studies on different over the years, and other people have done studies too. I'm sure many of you've read some of these studies to look at different levels of renewable energy. Decarbonize is another term. Decarbonize energy, clean energy by different dates. And you notice one of these early ones that was done in 2012. It went to 80% renewable energy by 2050 because we were pretty sure you couldn't get to 100% renewable energy, especially in 2012. That was not going to be economically possible. Technically possible, but not economically possible. And 80% was kind of a target back in 2012. And in 2021, we had another study in North America that was looking at, because we got a lot of integration between Canada and Mexico as well. And then by 2021 is the beginning of starting to think about, okay, what is 100% possible? Because the way things had gone on the electricity sector. And then we just had a recent study come out that my colleagues, Paul Denholm, Drew Mai, and others who, the next few slides are going to be from them, just completed this report that's 100% decarbonized electricity by 2035, which is, I will show you, is a very aggressive goal, to see what the supply side of that is possible. Started looking, of course, there's the demand side too. How do you reduce the demand side? They considered some of the demand in terms of increased electrification, but the kind of, is this feasible, especially economically feasible going into 2035? I'm going to show you some of the results of this study that they did. So real quick on the methodology, they looked at what the load forecasting is, how electricity use will change. 2035 is only 12 years from now. You guys will be like in the early stages of your career. You know, hopefully you'll finish your degree by then, and then you'll be 12 years. So anyway, it's not that far from now. So first step is, you know, understanding what the load might change, coming up with scenarios for that, doing the scenario analysis, and then understanding the costs and benefits of it. So they looked at different major scenario areas. One was all technology options are available. And then they used some references, and I'll show you those. Those are basically EIA and other reference points. Infrastructure means all the scenarios are available. This actually includes direct air capture too. This is everything, except it also means we'll be able to build all the transmission lines that we want. So this is the infrastructure. The constrained category, constrained scenario, is that people don't want increased transmission. People don't want new energy technologies taking up so much space. So what is that going to look like if you constrain the development? And then the last one is if we allow for no carbon capture and sequestration. So that would be the straight nuclear and renewable energy category, not the net zero option. And then there was 146 scenarios, lots of different sensitivities. You can go to this study if you want to read all the different options that they went through within these categories. And then again, a little bit, the goal was to minimize the capital and operational costs within the various constraints. So you wanted to be able to provide everybody electricity, have appropriate operating reserves, have enough space to do it, all the other things that required a good fuel supply, builds retirements, it took all that to capacity. It looked at existing capacity, it modeled the variable renewables, so solar and wind, on an hourly basis. It evaluated multiple different policies, and then looked at all the different cost trajectories and what technologies are available. Ran it through our REEDS model, and then the outputs is the generation and capacities transmission, the operation costs, the emissions, and the operating costs and the retail rates. And just kind of an example of one of the inputs, this is the temporal availability of variable renewables that were incorporated into the model. So you can see the blue is wind and the little pinky orange things are solar. And then this is showing how much sort of the solar availability, the the capacity factor, and then the wind capacity factor. Obviously a lot of wind more in the Midwest, which of course is where you need a lot of the transmission. And then on the right is just showing an example of the different models or different scenarios around spatial availability. So the top one is if we can build all the utility scale solar and wind anywhere we want. The middle one is kind of probably what's going to happen, a reference case, which means land that's really high mountain peaks, really that's maybe federal national parks, things that you can't access or taken out, or urban areas. And then limited access would be if you really limited the places where people did not want transmission or new build capacity. So this is kind of showing you the different spatial data that went into the model. So I'm going to go through a number of the different findings from this. Finding one is that it will be really challenging to fully decarbonize the US electricity system while meeting potential increased demand. So if we go from the EIA annual energy outlook, it shows just about a little under 1% growth in electricity demand. But if you do an accelerated electrification, so if you try to decarbonize, if you get a bunch of electric vehicles, everyone converts to heat pumps, all these things that are going to reduce our fuel usage and increase our electricity, we could have 3.5% annual growth of electricity, which we haven't seen since the 1950s, 60s, 70s in the US. It's not exceptionally high growth rate compared to what we've seen in the past, but it's high compared to the last 15 to 20 years. And when you have that much growth, you're going to have to reduce emissions that much more. So we are right now at about, so this is 2005, which is the baseline, which happens to be just about the peak of our emissions in the electricity sector. And we've actually been doing pretty well. This is the role of natural gas, reduction of coal, increase in efficiency, or conversion to LED lights, other things that are better insulation, better buildings. And so we're somewhere around here, about 40% reduction. But if we're trying to get to 100%, that means staying on the same path that we have been on, which actually seems kind of hopeful because it's kind of the same path. It's not steeper, but at the same time, it's still pretty daunting to get that by 2035. And if we grow, if we significantly go for advanced electrification, we're going to have to actually drop it, a significant more percent, at least another 10 or so percent. Decarbonizing the grid while keeping the economy on. So the goal, potentially the goal in this study was looking at reducing emissions across the economy. So not just the electricity sector, but transportation, other things. And this is going to require a massive development of clean energy resources. And this is looking at the different, so these are the reference scenarios. This is if we just sort of chug along where we are now. This is advanced electrification. So this is the growth in electricity demand that would be required. And then this is if we could build anything we want. This is if we could build all the grid transmission that we want, constrained and no carbon capture. Well, you can see it's a couple interesting things. One, you see huge growth in wind, pretty big growth in solar. That's in all of these cases. You see a decline in coal to basically zero. You see a slow decline in natural gas. It does not go to zero because remember, it allows carbon capture. So you're going to have this little bit. And the importance part of this part is typically for that last 10%. 90% is actually achievable. Last 10% is going to get really hard. And then what's interesting, the nuclear here is in red because this model looks at economics, and it's going to be really challenging for it economically to compete until you start constraining transmission and constraining land use for renewables. And then at that point, the model says maybe you're going to have a new build of nuclear power to be able to, because then it'll cost effectively be able to compete. Watching the time already over time. So how does this compare globally? Well, and how does it compare to where we've been when we say we're going to have to launch this much renewables? Well, this is about where we are in terms of wind deployment. This is deployment per year. And this is where we will need to be for the different options. So in the US, we did about 14 gigawatts of wind. We're going to have to triple that per year for the next 12 years. EV, not quite so much. We're at 15. We maybe need to double to triple it. This is compared to what China does every year. So we need to be installing more renewables than China is per year, or close to. So very daunting. Also, if the infrastructure model, this is the amount of transmission capacity that will have to be expanded. For the constrained model, we obviously aren't going to do as much because it's constraining the transmission, but it's going to increase our cost by 5 times on the transmission costs. Other options, you can see we're going to have to double our transmission capacity, easily double our transmission lines. So that may not be new transmission lines, but it's going to have to be improved transmission lines, but it's going to be a lot of new transmission lines. And then this is just the sort of showing some of the transmission requirements. And that's going to require changes to land use. You're going to need land to do these different transmission. Forward. But to put that in context, it's always important to put these in context. I think that's showing up. This is kind of comparing what amount of land space we would need for utility scale solar, and the different little colors are kind of the different scenarios, a little hard to see here. And then this is how much wind you would need. Now this little color is how much wind is for the actual pad for the wind turbine, as well as the roads that go to the wind turbine and the transmission, and the sort of immediate transmission. The dotted lines are if you count all the land that the wind farm is on, but you can use that land for agriculture. You can continue to grow crops, you can continue to have animals, other things. So it's more important to think about this, but this is sort of, you can think about that space as the amount of visual impact. People will be able to see something. Just as a comparison, this is how much urbanized areas, this is how much oil and gas take on federal land. This is missile testing ranges. So we're going to do less solar land than we do on missile testing. Corn ethanol on that side. And then this is how much land is for livestock grazing and feed. So up to you to decide if this is a lot or not very much. But always good to think about it in context. The big challenges of finding 5 of this study is that getting to 100% means overcoming seasonal imbalance. Sort of the daily is manageable, but there will be days when you are going to have combustion-based generation, particularly in the winter when you have a heating load, in the summer when you have a cooling load, and then in the spring and sometimes in the fall, you're going to have so many renewables that you're going to have to curtail. You're going to have to overbuild the renewables to fit these areas to try to match this, and then you're going to have too much of them in the spring. So this is where you're going to need some sort of seasonal storage. You don't want to just throw this electricity away, or you don't want to have to overbuild so much. So this is kind of modeling kind of what that would look like. Transmission will help with this as well. And then this is looking at what the cost, what's this going to cost people? Well, if we just keep going on our renewable path, it's actually going to be cheaper. Different types of getting to these 100% or these different scenarios, it will be higher priced electricity, but not necessarily anything higher than we've had in the past. So again, we've had very low price in recent years from a sort of a reference space. This is a difference from current prices. So, and again, if you constrain transmission, it's going to be the most expensive. And then the final finding here is, what are the benefits? Are there other benefits? Well, this is kind of the extra cost. So if it's negative, that means it's costing us money. But if you just look at the health benefits, which is largely around air quality, so improved air quality, the human life, there's lots of assumptions around here, right? But just the health benefits will pay for the investment required to do this. If you start counting climate, social cost of carbon, you can just make all sorts of assumptions about what numbers you want to use there, and that actually makes it significantly beneficial. Those, of course, are a bit more controversial because they're not as well defined, but these human health benefits around air quality are kind of standard numbers. But that money is saved in a different place from where it's invested, so it's different color of money. So that's, of course, makes it challenging. So, want to wrap up in just the last couple minutes here talking about what our future technology. So I said if we could 90%, we kind of know how to get there. That last 1%, we don't have maybe the right storage technologies. The technologies aren't as advanced where we want to go, especially around that interseasonal problem. So what are some possible solutions that we need more research on? First is, I think there's a lot of potential on geothermal. It's very underinvested. We've got a lot of hot, dry rocks without water in them, which is normally what you need for a geothermal. So there's a lot of interesting technologies where you're injecting or piping fluid for heat that can generate heat and electricity. And I think there's just an interesting study that came out for the geothermal potential in Texas. And so this could, and geothermal can, it's a renewable technology that can run 24/7 and actually be flexed quite a bit as well. People talk a lot about battery storage, as if we're going to build all this battery storage. Battery storage is good for hours. We need this seasonal. So there's a lot of subsurface storage technologies, compressed air, or gas storage, heat storage. both of those top two really are something the oil and gas industry could really, has the technology and the capabilities to really invest in and go into. I think there's potential in water energy, so wave and tidal, if we can solve some of those challenges around all the biofouling and other challenges those technologies operating in that harsh environment, but for coastal urban areas, be very good. And what I find very interesting is, something like 80 to 90% of the dams in the United States are not powered. They're just for water retention. They're just a flood prevention or water retention for agriculture. We could power some of those, even if they didn't run all year round. That would give us a giant water battery, as well as pumped hydro is another good seasonal storage. And then, of course, a lot of people are working on green hydrogen and high capacity batteries with different types of battery configurations that would be able to store energy for longer times. Distributed energy, I think, is going to be, a lot of these studies really focus on modifying large grid, but we could actually do more of a distributed model. So you have multiple interconnected microgrids and energy generators that are closer to the demand. This could potentially do incremental resiliency. If you cut one of them off, you still can generate and operate as a microgrid at the community or campus or industry scale. And this is actually a little picture. We did a study. How could you microgrid or power some of these remote areas that are generating oil and gas with renewables? Also, people looking at virtual power plants. You're basically bundling and coordinating the operation of a lot of small private generation and storage. And then that's operated in a way that interfaces in a coordinated way with the grid. So a number of companies are starting to look at these virtual power plants that actually end up doing payments to the consumer. You've got solar panels on your roof and a battery system, and then you'll get a note that says, hey, we need some of your electricity from your battery. We'll pay you $50 for it. You're like, yep. And then that goes into the grid, and then you just recharge it with those solar panels later. So this is a direction that I think we tend to focus on the large grid because the US has a large grid, but also other countries, this may be a way we want to go to be thinking about building out the electricity system in more this dynamic distributed way. And then I also want to mention the land use because I talked about the constrained scenario. So the land use is going to become an increasing issue with renewables, and we're already seeing it. And so we want to, we don't want to take good farmland for renewables. So how do we do that better? Well, wind turbines already are allowing, farmers can grow crops around it. They take a relatively small amount of space. They actually pay the landowners, thousands of dollars every year per turbine. And so farmers there have said that it provides a lot of stable income to them. It's not income that's based on the weather or based on variability in their crop growing. So, making sure that these facilities are beneficial to the landowners and also enable them to continue to operate their facilities. We're starting to see a movement towards agrivoltaics, which is agriculture and PV. And these are some examples where it's basically you're putting the panels higher up off the ground. Sometimes you're having spacing between them, sometimes not. And it allows you to grow typically high value crops underneath. And what's interesting is it actually, by providing partial shade, you end up getting more plants growing, you get more vegetables, especially in hot desert climates. It increases the soil moisture retention, so the soil keeps its moisture. And it actually improves the operation of the PV panels because this, rather than having a hot surface underneath, it's cooling underneath the PV panels and they operate actually several percent higher efficiency. So there's a whole project that's actually doing a study that looks at the co-benefits of agriculture. You obviously lose some generation. Sometimes you have to have a little space a little farther apart. You have to do a bit more robust poles, especially if you're going to have animals underneath them because they like to rub on them, they like to chew. So you have to make sure your wires are all safe. But these are ways that also provide benefit to the farmer and landowners because they're basically getting a power payment from the lease as well as be able to continue their agricultural. And then this is something that people jokingly call photovoltaics. It's floating solar. And you would not do this on a natural lake because you don't want to damage the lake, but water retention ponds, cooling ponds, irrigation canals. I think California's looking at putting these all along irrigation canals. It reduces evaporation, so it actually saves water, also keeps the panels cooler for operation. So people are actually, this is a picture from Japan of photovoltaic installation. So we're seeing a lot of interesting ways that you do land use for benefits. All right, last slide just to conclude, and that still gives us a few minutes for questions. So reminder of key challenges, our costs will increase as we approach 100% unless we get new technologies to go forward with. We may have significant growth in demand from electrification, so we need to plan for that. We expect an increase in weather and climate variability, so it needs to be able to accommodate droughts, heat waves. We've seen impacts on hydropower droughts, which is actually quite concerning. We want to make sure our mismatch of generation matches the timescale on an hourly and seasonal perspective. So we're going to need storage to get through the seasonal stage. Very careful, we need to be thinking about that social and land use constraints or technology acceptance, transmission that can't be ignored. We can develop the greatest thing ever, but if no one wants it next to their house, it's never going to be built. And then think about the definitional issues. Is nuclear included? Is large hydropower included? Is carbon capture included? How are we going to work with the existing energy industries going forward? So we're going to need these new technology solutions, both existing and new ones. So we're going to need to continue to fund the research into new technologies. And I think it's really important to recognize that all energy transitions have positive and negative. Remember I showed the manure crisis and the air pollution? We already know that there's challenges with our new energy transition going forward. That's okay. The key is to recognize it, find and recognize the solution, the challenges, and then seek the solutions before they became big problems. So everyone got concerned about you can't recycle wind turbine blades. We're already developing new solutions to recycle that before we have millions and millions of them to do so. So anticipate and mitigate the future problems. I mentioned community acceptance, siting and social acceptance, involving communities in the siting of these facilities and meeting them where they want to be able to do these technologies and making sure it benefits them, making sure the business models of when you bring these technologies there benefit the people that it's going to be impacting. And then there is multiple solutions. So I put a little goal in there, the 100%, whatever you want to call it, clean, renewable, whatever. It's going to be based on state infrastructure, national infrastructure, resources, social acceptance. It will not be one solution. Every country is not going to have the same solution. You can't say nuclear is going to be for everybody. Everyone's going to be 100% solar. Every country and region, and maybe even every town is going to have different solutions, and that's okay too. And the key is to do the modeling, to work with the communities, to come up with a solution that's for everybody. So that. There we go. So thank you very much. That concludes my talk. This is me at a wind farm out in North Texas. It's kind of fun. We could drive our car up to the wind turbine. So thank you. You're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. Email me with any questions, and I'll take any questions from you here.